What if the most powerful woman in the world spent 40 years of her reign dressed entirely in black, sleeping next to her dead husband's clothes every single night, and turning her entire empire into a monument to grief? Imagine a queen so consumed by death that she kept a cast of her beloved's hand on her bedside table and insisted that his shaving water be brought to his room every morning. For decades after he died, today we're uncovering the heartbreaking, unbelievable, sometimes truly unsettling story of Queen Victoria's bizarre obsession with death. An obsession so extreme that it shaped not just her personal life, but the culture of an entire era. From morbid rituals to shocking preservation methods, from séances to sleeping with the dead, Victoria's relationship with mortality was far darker and more disturbing than you ever imagined. By the time we reach the end, you'll understand how one woman's grief literally changed the way the world mourned. Number 10. The eternal shrine. When Prince Albert died of typhoid fever on December 14, 1861, something died in Victoria too, but what was reborn was far more disturbing. Within days of his death, she had his room at Windsor Castle sealed exactly as he left it. This wasn't just preservation, it was resurrection through ritual. Every morning for the next 40 years, servants were ordered to bring hot shaving water to Albert's room and lay out fresh clothes on his bed. His watch was wound daily. His writing materials were arranged precisely as he had left them. Victoria would sit in the room for hours talking to his portrait, asking for his guidance on state matters and treating his death as merely a temporary absence. But the most chilling detail, she kept a plaster cast of his hand on her bedside table, and according to her diary, she would hold it every night before sleep, sometimes for hours. Visitors reported that she would stroke it tenderly and whisper to it as if it could respond. The servants were so disturbed by this nightly ritual that several requested transfers to other royal households. The obsession extended beyond his room. Victoria ordered that Albert's desk in every royal residence be maintained exactly as he left it. His pen was filled with fresh ink daily. His letters remained open to the exact page where he had stopped reading. Even his half-finished sketches were preserved under glass, creating multiple shrines to death throughout the empire. Number 9. The clothes that never changed for 40 years. Nearly half her entire reign, Victoria wore nothing but black. But this wasn't just mourning attire. She commissioned hundreds of identical black dresses, each one exactly the same style, each one a uniform of grief. She insisted that even her underwear be black, and demanded that her ladies-in-waiting were black or gray at all times in her presence. The obsession extended to every detail of her appearance. She wore a miniature portrait of Albert on her wrist, another on her left hand, and carried a photograph of him in her pocket every day. When she died, they found 17 different photographs of Albert hidden in her clothes and personal effects, as if she couldn't bear to be separated from his image even for a moment. But it went further than personal clothing. Victoria insisted that the entire court adopt permanent half-mourning. Bright colors were banned from her presence. Flowers had to be white or purple. Even the horses pulling her carriage were required to wear black plumes. She created a visual landscape of death that extended far beyond her own person. The psychological impact on those around her was profound. Her children grew up in a world where joy was seen as betrayal of the dead. Her youngest daughter, Beatrice, later wrote that she couldn't remember her mother ever laughing after Albert's death, and that the sound of genuine happiness became foreign in the royal household. Number 8. The bedroom of the dead perfs. Most disturbing of all was Victoria's sleeping arrangement. She had Albert's nightgown laid out on his side of the bed every single night for 40 years. His pillow was fluffed. His side of the bed was turned down as if he might return. And according to her personal servant, she would often be found in the morning clutching his nightgown, having spent the night literally sleeping with the clothes of the dead. The servants whispered that she would sometimes wake in the middle of the night and have full conversations with the empty space beside her, discussing everything from state affairs to family matters. She genuinely believed she was communing with Albert's spirit, and her conviction was so complete that it convinced others around her that something supernatural was happening. but the bedroom held even more disturbing secrets. Victoria kept a photograph of Albert's death mask on her nightstand and would kiss it goodnight every evening. She preserved locks of his hair in a special locket that she wore to bed, often clutching it so tightly that servants would find marks on her palm. In the morning, the room began to smell of the lavender and rosemary she used to preserve his belongings, creating an almost shrine-like atmosphere that visitors found deeply unsettling. Most shocking of all, Victoria began sleeping with Albert's death shirt, the actual garment he wore when he died. She would hold it against her face and breathe in what she believed was his lingering scent. A practice that continued for decades until the fabric literally disintegrated from handling. Number 7. The Séance Queen. Victoria's obsession with death led her into increasingly dark territory. She became fascinated with spiritualism and regularly attended séances, desperately trying to contact Albert's spirit. She employed several mediums, including the famous John Brown, who claimed he could channel Albert's messages. During these séances, Victoria would become almost manic, asking rapid-fire questions about Albert's opinions on current events, whether he approved of her decisions, and what he wanted her to do next. Witnesses described her as transformed during these sessions, speaking in different voices and claiming to receive direct instructions from her dead husband. The most unsettling part: she began making important political decisions based on what she believed were Albert's messages from beyond. Foreign policy, domestic legislation, even decisions about her children's marriages were all influenced by what she claimed were communications from the dead. The séances became more elaborate and disturbing over time. Victoria would insist on holding objects that had belonged to Albert during the sessions, believing they strengthened the connection. She kept a special communication room at Balmoral Castle, where she would spend hours attempting to contact not just Albert, but all of her deceased relatives and friends. These sessions often left her in a state of emotional exhaustion, but also euphoric. She would emerge claiming to have received detailed instructions from Albert about everything from military strategy to the design of new buildings. Her private secretary noted that she seemed to live more in the world of the dead than the living, and that her grip on reality appeared to be loosening as the years passed. Number 6. The children of grief. Victoria's obsession with death profoundly affected her 9 children, but her treatment of them after Albert's death was particularly disturbing. She saw them not as individuals but as living extensions of Albert's memory. She would often stare at her children with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. Searching for resemblances to their dead father, her daughter Vicky later wrote that her mother would sometimes burst into tears when looking at her, saying she looked too much like Albert. The children were required to visit Albert's shrine room regularly and were expected to show appropriate grief and reverence. Those who seemed too happy or carefree were scolded for forgetting Papa. Most disturbingly, Victoria began planning her children's deaths almost obsessively. She would discuss their future funerals, design their mourning clothes, and even plan their memorial services while they were still alive and healthy. Her son Bertie, later Edward VII, complained that his mother treated him like he was already dead, planning his legacy rather than nurturing his life. When her daughter Alice died in 1878, Victoria's reaction was both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. She claimed to be relieved that Alice was reunited with Papa and spent more time planning Alice's memorial than comforting her surviving grandchildren. She seemed to view her children's deaths as victories rather than tragedies. Number 5. The Mourning Industrial Complex. Personal obsession became a cultural phenomenon that transformed British society. She essentially created what historians now call the mourning industrial complex, an entire economy built around death and grief. Mourning jewelry became mandatory. Elaborate funeral rituals became social expectations. Families were expected to observe increasingly complex mourning periods, with specific clothes, behaviors, and restrictions for different stages of grief. The wealthy spent fortunes on elaborate mourning clothes, memorial jewelry made from hair of the deceased, and complicated funeral arrangements, but Victoria took it further. She commissioned hundreds of portraits, sculptures, and memorials to Albert, spending what would be millions in today's money. She had his face carved into everything from door handles to wallpaper patterns. Every room and every royal residence had at least one image of Albert, creating an empire-wide shrine to death. The Queen's influence was so powerful that entire industries emerged to serve the culture of mourning she created. Shops specializing in mourning clothes appeared in every major city. Artisans developed new techniques for creating jewelry from human hair. Photography studios began specializing in post-mortem portraits. Victoria had literally commercialized death. The social pressure to mourn properly became so intense that families would bankrupt themselves to meet the expectations Victoria had established. Women were expected to wear black for at least 2.5 years after losing a husband. Children were required to wear black armbands for months after losing a parent. The entire empire became a landscape of perpetual grief. Number 4. The secret diaries. Victoria kept detailed diaries throughout her life. But after Albert's death, they became increasingly disturbing documents of her obsession with death and the afterlife. She addressed daily letters to Albert addressing him as if he were still alive and could receive her. Correspondence. These diary entries reveal the full extent of her psychological deterioration. She would write detailed descriptions of her dreams about Albert, often claiming they were actual visits from his spirit. She recorded conversations she believed she had with him, complete with his supposed responses and advice. Most disturbing were her entries about wanting to join Albert in death. She wrote repeatedly about her desire to die and be reunited with him, describing elaborate fantasies about their reunion in the afterlife. She even planned her own death in detail, including how she wanted to be positioned in her coffin to mirror Albert's pose. The diaries also reveal her growing paranoia and detachment from reality. She began to see signs and messages from Albert everywhere in cloud formations. In the behavior of animals, in the arrangement of objects, she interpreted every coincidence as a communication from beyond, and her entries show a mind increasingly consumed by supernatural thinking. Number 3. The macabre mementos. Victoria's collection of death-related objects was extensive and deeply disturbing. Beyond Albert's preserved belongings, she began collecting items associated with death and mourning from around the world. She had special cabinets filled with what she called sacred relics, objects that had belonged to deceased friends and family members. She kept locks of hair from everyone who had died in her lifetime, arranged in elaborate displays with photographs and personal effects. She had jewelry made from the hair of her deceased children, would wear different pieces depending on which child she was honoring that day. Most shocking was her collection of death masks and funeral photographs. She commissioned death masks of family members and close friends, and would display them prominently in her private rooms. She had a special album of post-mortem photographs, and would spend hours looking through them while discussing the deceased as if they were still alive. Victoria also collected funeral programs, memorial cards, and even pieces of fabric from the funeral clothes of deceased relatives. She would touch these items regularly, believing they maintained a connection to the dead. Her private rooms became increasingly cluttered with these macabre mementos, creating spaces that visitors found deeply unsettling. Number 2. The madness of John Brown. Victoria's Scottish servant became far more than just an employee. He became her primary connection to the world of the dead. Brown claimed to have psychic abilities and convinced Victoria that he could channel messages from Albert. Their relationship became so intense and inappropriate that it scandalized the court and the public. Brown would conduct private séances with Victoria, during which he would claim to become possessed by Albert's spirit. During these sessions, Brown would allegedly speak in a different voice, giving Victoria advice and instructions that she believed came directly from her dead husband. The Queen became completely dependent on these communications, refusing to make any major decisions without consulting Albert through Brown. The relationship was so disturbing that several court officials attempted to have Brown dismissed, but Victoria protected him fiercely. She gave him unprecedented access to her private rooms and personal effects, and even allowed him to handle Albert's belongings, something she permitted no one else to do. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria's grief was almost as intense as it had been for Albert. She immediately began trying to contact Brown's spirit, believing that he and Albert were now together in the afterlife and could communicate with her jointly. She commissioned a controversial statue of Brown and insisted on visiting his grave, regularly behavior that further convinced many that she had lost her grip on reality. Number 1. The final obsession when Victoria herself died in 1901. The full extent of her death obsession was revealed, and it was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Her funeral instructions were incredibly specific and deeply unsettling. She wanted to be buried with Albert's dressing gown, locks of hair from all her dead children, and dozens of photographs and personal mementos. But the most shocking discovery came when they prepared her body. Hidden beneath her official mourning clothes, they found a photograph of John Brown placed over her heart, along with a lock of his hair. She had literally taken her obsession with death and the dead to the grave. Her funeral arrangements were equally macabre. She had planned every detail decades in advance, including the specific positioning of her body to mirror Albert's in his tomb. She wanted to be buried with her wedding veil, not as a symbol of marriage, because she believed it would help Albert recognize her in the afterlife. Most disturbing of all, Victoria had secret compartments built into her coffin to hold additional mementos and photographs. She had been planning her own death for 40 years, had filled her final resting place with objects that represented her obsession with death and the supernatural. The servants who prepared her body were shocked to discover that she had been wearing Albert's wedding ring on a chain around her neck for 40 years, and that the skin beneath had become permanently discolored from the constant contact with the metal. Even in death, she could not bear to be separated from the physical remnants of those she had lost. Conclusion. From the preserved shrine rooms of Windsor Castle to the séance chambers of Balmoral, the mourning parlors of London to the furthest reaches of the British Empire, Queen Victoria's bizarre obsession with death shaped not just her own tortured existence, but the entire cultural landscape of grief, mourning, and our relationship with mortality itself. For 40 years, the most powerful woman in the world lived more with the dead than the living. She slept with death. Masks, conducted government business through séances, and transformed an entire empire into a monument to her grief. Her children grew up in a world where death was more present than life, where the supernatural was treated as fact, and where the boundary between the living and the dead became increasingly blurred. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how completely Victoria's madness was accepted and even celebrated by her subjects. Her obsession with death became their obsession. Her rituals became their rituals. Her grief became their way of life. She didn't just mourn her husband, she taught an entire civilization to worship death itself. The Victorian era's elaborate mourning customs, our modern funeral industry, even our contemporary fascination with ghost stories and the supernatural, all of it can be traced back to one woman's inability to let go of the dead. Victoria's legacy wasn't just political or cultural, it was psychological, rewiring how humanity itself thinks about death, grief, and the possibility of life after death in the end. Queen Victoria's greatest achievement wasn't expanding the British Empire or presiding over an era of prosperity. It was proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't love or ambition or even fear. It's the refusal to accept that death is final. Her 40-year conversation with the dead reminds us that grief, when taken to its extreme, can become a kind of madness that reshapes not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. What started as one woman's personal tragedy became humanity's blueprint for how to live with loss. And in that transformation, Victoria achieved a kind of immortality that even she, in all her obsession with death, could never have imagined.